So, like they said, my name is Stephen Schwartz, and I am from the University of Illinois, as it says on the slide. And today I want to talk about high-yield corn and soybeans. I'm really passionate about how we can increase productivity in corn and soybeans through a variety of different management systems. So I'm going to talk a lot of hard agronomy and show data on why these practices matter and what really is important when we're trying to manage crops better. So I want to give a little bit of my background first. I didn't grow up on a farm. I'm from north central Indiana, just outside of Indianapolis actually, and I didn't grow up on a farm. But my dad has been an agronomist for 38 years. That's him up there on the slide. If you can tell me which one's which, I'd love to know, because we look exactly the same. And so I love hunting, I love being outside, and some of my earliest memories are actually going out and walking fields with him when I was a little kid and learning how to identify weeds and diseases and nutrient deficiencies when I was about 10 years old in Indiana. So agronomy is something I have always loved, and it has been really driven through my dad. Now, when I was going to figure out where I was going to go pursue my education, he said, you can go anywhere you want as long as it's located in West Lafayette, Indiana. So I went to Purdue University, and I was really fortunate to go there and get a double major in agronomy and ag business. So my background is the science, but also how can we make these practices pay, because they have to work for your guys' operations. So fortunately, I was able to meet my wife when I was there at Purdue University. We got married last August, which has been an absolute blessing. And then after I finished my degree at Purdue, I went to the University of Illinois. Crossed over the border. There's still some animosity between the two universities, but we won in basketball this year, so that's all that matters to me. Purdue is, that is. So I'm from Dr. Fred Belo's lab. So Tim has been showing you the nutrient uptake curves. That's what we're very widely known for, is because we take a physiological approach to nutrient management. So we want to identify what the crop needs exactly at the right time and be able to provide that nutrition. And so we've been conducting small plot research all across the state of Illinois for the last 2 years. This is one of our sites. You can see kind of our field laid out inside a grower's operation there, and that's in southern Illinois. And for the last 2 years, I've gotten the opportunity to do what I love, which is talk about high-yield corn and soybeans with a variety of growers, and that's why I'm here today. So this is our crop physiology team. I just want to introduce kind of the overview of what we do. There's 3 main segments to our lab. The first one is genetics and nitrogen. That's where we're looking at hybrid and variety interactions, and how can we use nitrogen management systems to optimize yield. The second group is general fertility. So that's phosphorus, potassium, zinc, sulfur, boron. How can we manage those nutrients to increase crop yield? And I'll be talking mainly on genetics and nitrogen and general fertility today. I won't be diving much into the biological additives portion. We've done quite a lot of research on how to use biologicals in a systems approach to nutrient management, but I won't be touching on that very much today. So we do all this small plot research, and I've said it a couple times now, but what is small plot research? What does it look like? So what we do is we'll take a field and we break that down into 90 smaller fields, for example, and we have 15 different fertility practices in the field, and we'll replicate those 6 times throughout the field. So at the end of the day, when we go to harvest, we get these treatment averages that are based on 6 unique plots throughout the field, 4 rows wide and 40 feet deep. So all the data you're going to be seeing today is coming from this type of small plot research setup. But to conduct that research, we do this all across Illinois, like I said, in northern, central, and southern Illinois. It's a big state, and so as you can see here on the slide, there's a big difference in soil environments and soil fertility levels as you go from northern Illinois to southern. So most of my experience back home has been with low fertility soil. So when we're in Champaign or northern Illinois, I feel very blessed to get to work with that kind of inherent soil fertility. But there's a big range in our environments, and that's something that's important to note. So we conduct a lot of research all across the state of Illinois. But to do that, we have a research convoy. We have to move all of our equipment all over the state, which is a challenge, but I also wanted to introduce you guys to some of the small plot equipment that we use on a daily basis. So whenever we're talking about broadcast applications, we use a drop spreader. It's a little bit more efficient than, say, a spinner spreader for the research that we're going to be conducting. And a lot of our fertility, we compare broadcast to banding. So we use a dry product toolbar to band nutrients 4 to 6 inches below the soil surface, and then we plant right on top of that band using GPS to improve nutrient management. But we also do in-season management with a liquid wide drop toolbar. So we have four products that we can go on the fly in either in a mid-row coulter or in a wide drop scenario to do that in-season nutrient management as well. This is our 2-row rotary combine. I think I'm contractually obligated to put this on the slide. This piece of equipment actually costs a little over $500,000 for 2 rows. So we always like to talk about this is our baby, but it's a great combine, but it is proof that equipment prices are on the rise. All of that equipment is fantastic, but my personal favorite piece of equipment whenever we travel is the coffee pot. We have to bring that with us because I can't function without coffee, so I think this is the most important piece of equipment that we have in the crop physiology lab. So I wanted to show you this picture. This is an image from my deer stand in southern Indiana. I took this fall, actually in November. I was out on a deer hunt, and there's a deer that I've been looking for a long time. It's kind of hard to see on there. He's a 12-point buck, and this morning he came out in the field. He was chasing a couple does, and I thought, this is my chance. I've been looking for this buck for 3 years now, and I've never actually gotten him out in front of me. And he was there, and I was ready to go. And I thought, okay, this is the year that I'm going to get this buck that I've been chasing. And I pulled my rifle out, and I missed. I dropped the shot low, and the buck ran away. I hunted the rest of the season, and I never saw him again. So either somebody else got him, or he knows where I'm at, and I've missed my chance. Now, I hear that story quite a lot from other farmers that I talk to, but they're not talking about deer. They're talking about other big marks that they haven't hit. And a lot of times it's 350 bushel corn and 100 bushel beans. And somewhere along the way, we've missed the mark and we're not hitting those goals that we're trying to achieve. And so today, that's why I want to talk about hitting the mark. How do we achieve high yields and make sure when the opportunity is there, we don't miss? So I'm going to start out with corn and management systems and ask you, what management factor for corn production do you think has changed the most in the last 50 years? Now, I'll give you some multiple choice options. Anybody here want to venture a guess? What do you think has changed the most over the last 5 years? Is it early planting, planting populations, nitrogen fertilizer, yield potential? What do you guys think? Anybody? Well, I'm going to argue today that it's the plant population over time. So as we look at grain yields on the left, planting populations on the right, and year, we see there is almost a linear relationship between increasing plant populations over time and higher grain yields. And so what this tells us is, actually every year, on average, in the United States, there's 400 more plants per acre planted across the country. So as we continue to grow, go into the future, we're going to have to deal with higher planting populations. Now the question is, what happens to the plant's root size as we increase our planting populations? Will it get smaller? And we know this in the crop physiology lab because we do quite a bit of root washing. So we go into the field and we dig up plants and we bring them back and we wash the roots off. And it's an extremely fun process. Some of my lab mates don't think it's quite fun. It's a little dirty, a little muddy, a little wet, but I just think they have a bad attitude about it personally. It's a great way to collect data and learn about what's going on underneath the soil surface. So when we look at the rooting response to population, what we've seen over the last several years is that as you increase planting populations, you're actually decreasing the weight and size of your root system. So for every 1,000 more seeds you plant, we've seen that you lose 2% of your root mass. So that's a big difference as you go from 30,000 plants per acre to 36. That's 12% of your root size is gone just because of your planting population. But can we manage root size? So that was our next question is this inherent characteristics of increasing planting populations? What can we do about this problem? And so we started to look at row spacing. So on the left, you see 30-inch rows with 44,000 plants per acre. And on the right, you see 20-inch rows with, again, 44,000 plants per acre. What's the difference? Well, if you look at these kind of an over-the-top view, you see the plant-to-plant spacing is dramatically increased when you go to a 20-inch row spacing compared to 30s, right? 4.8 inches between plants in the 30s 7 inches between plants in a 20-inch row system. So what happens when we increase that plant-to-plant spacing? Well, your roots actually get bigger. So what we're looking at here is, again, the weight of the root in 30 and 20-inch row spacing at 3 different densities. And what's really interesting to me is that your root size in a 20-inch row system under 44,000 plants per acre is the exact same as 38,000 plants per acre in a 30-inch row. Same size root. And we see the same thing even as we go up to 50,000 plants per acre. In a 20-inch row, you have the same root size as 44,000 in a 30-inch. So this means we can manage root size, and we can work to make sure that our plants are always have good access to soil nutrition. Now the question is, I can talk about root size and grams per root and all this kind of stuff. Does this actually translate to yield? There's been a lot of questions about how 20-inch rows perform yield in a comparison to 30s. Well, what we've seen is that there is a dramatic yield increase in 20-inch rows compared to 30s because of that plant-to-plant spacing. Both of these systems have the exact same nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, everything's exactly the same. The only change is row spacing. And we've seen this yield increase. Now, the thing that I really like to highlight here is that 286 bushel number. In 20-inch row spacing, you can plant 38,000 plants per acre, and that is higher than every population in 30-inch rows. So it's not that you have to go 20-inch rows and go all the way up to 50,000 plants per acre. Just by using narrow rows, we've been able to increase our yields compared to a 30-inch row setting. So the key here for us is, when we're trying to achieve higher yields, we believe that 20-inch rows are the best way to achieve that increase in yield because they can support higher populations effectively. But the thing is, we all know that hybrids aren't the same. So hybrid management and selection of those hybrids is extremely important. So these are hybrids ranked from 1 to 36 based on yield over the last several years in our hybrid evaluation study. I don't put the names of the hybrids on here because that's not what I care about. But when we look at this ranking, what's interesting, when we change out those ranks for the relative maturities, we see an interesting trend. We took the top 10 yielding hybrids, looked at their average relative maturity and yield, and compared them to the bottom 10 hybrids, their relative maturity and yield. And we've seen that as you increase your maturity relative to your specific location that you're at, we get higher yields. Now the yield difference between relative maturities is going to change year over year, but we believe, and we've seen, that increasing your maturity group is actually going to improve your yield potential when you're planting that seed at the beginning of the year. Now the question is, how do we learn to select hybrids for high yields and narrow row systems? Because like I just said, all hybrids are not the same. So to do that, we have a management yield potential trial that we do here at the University of Illinois, all across the state, where we compare a standard system to intensive management. Now, what is intensive management, right? This means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. It could be narrow rows, fungicide, banded fertility, a lot of different things. But as a crop physiology student, we all know what intensive management is and what it actually looks like. And it looks like that. It's whenever we're giving a presentation, it's Dr. Bilo standing in the background with his arms crossed, intensively managing our performance. But fortunately, we have a lot more tools in our tool chest than just Dr. Bilo standing in the back staring at me. So for our intensive system, we like to improve upon the standard management by adding nitrogen side dress, banded fertility, where we're looking at added nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, zinc. We add foliar protection, and then we also add higher planting populations in a narrow row system. And we want to look at what is the benefit of this enhanced management over a standard system. So I've just pulled 3 hybrids from this system to look at our standard and enhanced. And what's the response to this? I mean, that's a lot of nutrition and work that we're putting in to get an enhanced system. What's the yield advantage for those top 3 hybrids there? Well, we actually didn't see that dramatic of a response over the last 3 years with those 3 hybrids, but we looked at a different set, same standard yields in general, but our response to management was way different. That's the kind of responses I expect out of that intensive system. So what's the difference between these 2 groups of hybrids? The answer is workhorse versus racehorse hybrids. Now, What is a workhorse or racehorse hybrid? That gets thrown a lot, those terminologies get thrown out a lot in the seed industry. So let's try to break down, what does that mean? When we think about racehorse hybrids, we hear a lot of times things like top end yield potential, you have to push this hybrid, they're more responsive, and a workhorse is more stable across yield environments. It can handle stress, it's more tolerant and steady. But my question is, what do you call a hybrid that has both workhorse and racehorse characteristics? And that, my friends, would be a unicorn. If you can find one of these hybrids, please capture it, bring it to me, and I would love to plant it on every acre of my farm, because I would love that hybrid. But in all reality, there aren't unicorns. So we have to, I think, have a new definition for how we think about hybrids. And my proposed definition is looking at small-rooted versus large-rooted hybrids. So which of these two would respond better to higher planting population? Well, I'm going to answer that question in the traditional agronomy way, which is, it depends. There is not a necessarily precise answer in every single yield environment. So let's dive a little bit deeper into how these hybrids would perform with high populations. So what we're looking at here is just the natural inherent soil fertility in a small-rooted hybrid. So you're going to have less root crowding, but you're going to have a higher yield potential because there's not going to be as much competition. However, with natural soil conditions, it can't handle the stress from high planting populations because it doesn't have enough root mass to interact with the soil and have access to that nutrition. But when we look at large-rooted hybrids, there's more root crowding, so we're going to have a lower yield potential overall, but it can still mine the soil at higher populations, so it's more stable. But this is where we start to bring in the concepts of improved nutrition, right? With banded fertility, with better placement and better access to that nutrition, a small-rooted hybrid becomes more responsive, and a large-rooted hybrid is less responsive because it can do a better job, a large-rooted hybrid, for instance, can do a better job accessing the soil's nutrition without banded fertility. And when we look at these hybrids, I said they were workhorse or racehorse hybrids. The reality is that's actually the difference between the hybrids that we've characterized as large-rooted or small-rooted in the crop physiology lab over the last several years. So the key here is we need to support higher planting populations, and we can do that with 20-inch rows, but we also need to select small-rooted hybrids with a greater response to management. And that's something that you should be asking your seed dealers is, what is the rooting type of the hybrids that we're using? Because if you're going to go to an intensively managed system, a small-rooted hybrid is where you want to go. But how do we feed more plants, right? So we've talked about hybrids and increased planting populations, but how do we feed more plants? And this is where we like to talk about using banding compared to a broadcast system. And that banded fertilizer, right, we're putting that fertilizer below the soil surface, directly where the crop needs it, so that later in the season, it will have access to that nutrition exactly in the root zone, right when it needs it. It's kind of like the concept behind sub-drip irrigation, right? It's putting that nutrition exactly where the crop needs it. But another benefit of banded fertility over broadcast is not only can you support higher populations, but it's more consistent and stable than a broadcast system. In broadcast applications, a lot of times we see plants left behind because it's an uneven spread of your fertilizer. And with banding, you can provide the exact same nutrition to every single plant all the time. And that's extremely important when we carry this out to the end of the season, right? Because a plant left behind will not yield the same, and that's when we start to have this effect of we're leaving yield potential on the table when we don't have that fertility right where the crop needs it all the time. So I want to talk about banding and its responses in nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium next. So we have this is our broadcast application, 100% broadcast your nitrogen up front. What's the benefit of a side dress application, right? That's normally what we would do if we're going to move to a more enhanced system. What does side dress give us? Well, we've seen over the last 3 years, it's been a 12 bushel yield advantage over standard management. That's a good response to side dress nitrogen. But if we stay with a side dress system and instead of broadcasting our pre-plant nitrogen, we band it, what happens? We get 7 more bushels over our broadcast with side dress, and it's 19 bushels over our standard grower management practice. But when we band all of our nitrogen up front, we've actually seen a 15 bushel yield response. What I like about this is that the difference between our broadcast side dress system and our banding up front is the difference between a 1-pass and a 2-pass system. If we can provide nutrition to the crop throughout the growing season with a banded application, we can save a trip through the field and still get comparable yield advantage. Now, the best application for nitrogen there is banding with a side dress. That's what gives us the most consistency, and allows us to manage our risk, environmental risk, throughout the entire growing season. But banding nitrogen does have advantages for providing that season-long nutrition. What about phosphorus and potassium? So this is our nitrogen-only control, so it has 180 pounds of nitrogen on it. When we broadcast MAP and potash over the last 3 years, we saw 9 bushel yield response. In Illinois, that's a pretty good response to fertility. When we banded it instead of broadcast, we doubled our response to added P and K because we're putting that fertilizer exactly where the crop needs it all the time. So this is why we think that banding pairs very nicely with higher planting populations, because as you see on the left, it's plants per acre, and then it's our response to either broadcast or banded fertility. And at 30,000 plants per acre, there's no difference between broadcast or banding. But as we go to 36 and even 42,000 plants per acre, broadcast applications can't support higher populations effectively, while banding continues to support them effectively for higher and higher yields. So that's why better fertilizer management really is key to giving us the opportunity to capture higher yields that come from higher planting populations. So Tim mentioned a little bit earlier this quest for 500 bushel corn. Really, this is where we take all these agronomic concepts I've been talking about and put them together in a system to say, when we use all this stuff together, what's our maximum yield that we can achieve? How do we use intensive management to achieve truly high yield corn? So in this year I'm going to show you 4 hybrids, and we compared them in a standard management system, which is 34 or 40,000 plants per acre, no phosphorus or potassium, no irrigation, no foliar protection. It's just 180 pounds of nitrogen up front. And we compared that to an intensive system, which is 3 different planting populations in 20-inch rows, and we used a sub-drip irrigation system to provide season-long irrigation, foliar protection, and extensive fertility. Now, when I say extensive fertility, it's important to note that corn yield is determined all throughout the growing season. We've been talking a lot about pre-plant applications of fertility, but you have to make sure that you're feeding that crop at V6, at V12, VT, and even all the way out through the grain fill time frame, because there's a lot of different times in that crop's life cycle when it needs adequate nutrition. So, as we look at these nutrient uptake curves for phosphorus and potassium, if you try to put your nutrition right there where the star is, pre-plant, all the time, I think you're giving up something on the backside, which is where all of our grain fill potential comes through. So it's important to have both late and early season fertility to maximize your crop yield, which is not an easy thing to do. Which is why we have a subsurface drip irrigation system. In Champaign, we get a lot of rainfall. To be quite honest with you, we don't use this as an irrigation management system, but we still think there's a lot of value in having SDI as a nutrient delivery system. For us, this is another tool in our toolbox to provide season-long nutrition to the crop. And so we use it. We rely on this SDI system to provide nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, zinc, and boron throughout the entire growing season to make sure that the crop is never stressed. So what happens with our intensive, when we compare this intensive versus standard system? Well, hopefully you can see the intensive is there kind of in the background, standards in the foreground. We have bigger plants, and over the last 4 years, our response to this intensive and standard system is plus 90 bushels. So there's a big difference between intensive and standard. But what about, I want to break down quickly what happens when we look at these hybrids individually. So that's all 4 of our hybrids in a 34,000 plants per acre standard management system. Those are pretty traditional yields for where we're at in central Illinois. But what happens when we move to 40,000 plants per acre in a standard system? Well, we see this quite often, that you're going to have tip back, you're losing yield potential because a standard system isn't going to support the higher populations that we need to achieve high yield. And we saw that again this year, where we went backwards with 3 out of the 4 hybrids. 6357, I'm going to talk about it in a second. And I included that one to talk about the genetic diversity, and picking the right hybrid is so key when we're trying to get high yields. But a lot of times that standard system can't support us at 40,000 plants per acre. But what about when we go to an intensive management system, right? Same planting population, what's our yield increase? Those are the kind of yield increases that I would hope to see with an intensive system, especially if you notice the ones that are longer maturity. That would be 15J91 and 7027. Those are the longer maturity hybrids. So at 40 and 50,000 plants per acre, we're getting increased yields. But if you notice, 6357 was best optimized at 40,000 plants per acre. It didn't like higher and higher populations. So again, I want to stress, that's the importance of knowing your hybrids and using them in the right management system. But we also went up to 60,000 plants per acre, which you think, I've been saying this whole time, higher planting populations, higher yield. So at 60, that must be our highest yield potential, right? 60,000 plants per acre. But this happened. And this is something that's really important to note when you're talking about higher planting populations. As you move to more and more intensive management systems, Mother Nature and the environment does have a factor. And 60,000 plants per acre still gives you pretty small stalks, and it's a big plant that catches a lot of wind, and it can break very, very easily. So when we went up to 60,000 plants per acre, that's what happened to our yields. They went crashed and burned because they couldn't handle the environmental stresses. So we have to not only manage our crop through better practices, right? But we also have to keep in the back of our mind that the environment is a limiting factor for our yields. And we saw that especially this year with high winds. On average, putting all this stuff together, we got 65, 119, 53, and 100 bushel yield advantage to these intensive management practices when we're using that sub-drip irrigation system to provide our nutrition throughout the growing season, narrow rows, higher planting populations. That's what we've been able to achieve, which we're really proud of. So kind of in summary, how do we look at achieving 350 bushel corn? Well, we want to feed and protect a higher density of the best racehorse hybrids, and we want to do that through narrow rows, full season hybrids, and banded fertility. But I don't think that any of the yield advantages we saw with that intensive system would have been possible without the fertigation system that we had to deliver nutrition right to that root zone throughout the growing season. I think that's an integral part of intensive management. Now, I've talked a lot about corn. I'm going to switch over to soybeans for a second and talk about how can we try to achieve higher yields with soybeans. A lot of people think that soybeans may be less responsive to management, so let's talk about how we can maybe manage those for high yield. So I'm going to start with the quest. Again, the quest for 150 bushel beans, and we have a very, very similar approach, right? We have standard management versus an intensive system. And in standard, it's planting your beans in 30-inch rows and walking away. But for our intensive management, we still use season-long irrigation, fertility, 20-inch row spacing, but also importantly, we use foliar protection. I think this is a really important piece of high-yield soybeans that I'm going to dive into a little bit later, but foliar protection is key for managing beans for higher yield. So what happened? 2021, we had standard management beans. Those are actually really good yields for us. 80 bushel beans without doing anything to them in Champaign. That's really good. But as we look at this intensive system, we were able to achieve 100 bushel, 115 bushel, 118 bushel beans with this intensive system. Now, if you notice that as we increase our maturity group, we actually get an increase in our response to intensive management. So kind of similar to corn, I'll talk about this a little bit later. As we plant fuller maturity group beans, we have an increasing response to management. And actually, on average, we got a 26 yield bushel advantage, but 118 is actually the highest crop physiology lab soybean yield. So we weren't able to achieve 500 bushels for corn, but I did maximize our soybean yield in Champaign, which I was really proud of. I have to throw this picture up here. That's what 118 bushel beans looks like for us. It's just loaded with pods from top to bottom. So I was looking at 118, and I thought to myself, how did that happen? Like, we're trying to look backwards. What did it take to achieve 118 bushel beans? Well, first off, it was an early planting date. So we planted these beans on April 16th, which allowed us to capture more of that season. But we also used narrow rows and foliar protection. I think those are two keys to higher managed beans. fertility, season-long irrigation, and the right genetics. And this is going to be the roadmap for where I'm going in the next couple minutes to talk about high-yield soybeans. I'm not going to talk about irrigation very much because, again, we have a lot of rainfall in Champaign, and that really isn't a main driving factor. But I did want to tell a quick story where we have our sub-drip irrigation system in this high-yield environment. Right next to it, I have some beans, just a normal standard trial, where we were irrigating them during the reproductive growth stages to make sure that we could have the highest yield potential possible for this trial. And those beans actually averaged 98 bushels for the entire trial average, just had a little extra nitrogen up front. And right beside this field that doesn't have any added irrigation, same trial, just didn't have irrigation. This year, that difference in yield was 23 bushels. The difference in irrigation for us in 2021 on soybeans, 23 bushels difference. A lot of guys in the lab were upset with me because I had my trials on the irrigation site and they didn't. But I do think that irrigation is especially key for managing reproductive growth in soybeans. So let's talk really quickly about why do we want to plant soybeans early? What's the point of it? So over the last nine years now, we've looked at the yield of our unfertilized control plots. So every dot on there is a trial, and it's just the beans that we planted and harvested, did nothing to them, and we plotted that by planting date. I look at this and I see two things. One, I see a grouping in early April that's similar, and there's a grouping that's May and on that also has a similar impact. So we put a regression equation to this. This is just some fancy math that says, well, how are these points acting? And if we look in April, the number up there says negative 0.0001. That means that line is flat. When we planted beans in April, they yielded similarly based on planting date. Now there's differences in there, right? The beans yield from above 100 to below 100, but in April, the planting date wasn't the driving factor for yield. But for every day that we planted after May 1st, the number was negative 0.5. So that means for us, we lost a half bushel per acre per day every day we planted after April 30th. So planting date, you can still get high yield beans if you're planting after April, but you're losing yield potential, which is what we're always trying to capture and manage through intensive systems. But why do we want to plant soybeans early? So I want to show some data quickly from BASF, from A.J. Woodyard at the Midwest Research Farm. They looked at the number of days in each growth stage by planting date. So the orange bar is April 30th, May 1st planted beans, and then we have May 22nd beans in green, and June 5th is the yellow bar. How many days are in each of these growth stages? And what they saw was the only difference between planting date was the number of days in R2. That provided our plants the ability to have more nodes and have more flowers. The rate of pod abortion and flower abortion is consistent across these planting dates, but because we were able to have more of those flowers and more of those nodes, that's where the yield increase from early planted beans is coming from. So we want to maximize the number of days this plant has at R2. But there are some concerns when you plant early. We saw this year. We planted beans on April 1st, and they were snowed on, but we were a little bit worried about them. I was stressed about these beans. And I want to look real quickly. We have two beans side by side. The one on the left, that would be a mostly protected growing point, but the one right next to it, that is an unprotected growing point. So if the one on the right, if the frost comes in and kills that growing point, that bean is dead. It's not coming back. But the one that's on the left, soybeans have the ability to have other meristems come out from their growing points, and that bean should be able to survive. So I want to follow these beans and this plot in particular throughout the rest of the growing season and show you what happened to them. So hopefully you can see here on the screen, we have uneven stand, uneven emergence, different growth stages of beans. That was probably the ugliest field that we have ever planted in the crop physiology lab. It was uneven, it was bad. We came back at the end of the growing season, and that's the same plot. It looked beautiful. It looked like there had never been a problem with planting at all. And actually the yield of our unfertilized control did nothing to it. It was 85 bushel beans. So even with the crappy stand and the reduced emergence and the different growth stages, these beans are able to recover even when they're damaged early. So the key here for early planting, I'm going to leave you with three things with this. Beans are resilient after frost damage. Make sure that you have your right planting population that you can handle a reduction in stand, but beans are resilient. Delayed planting as we move into late May, that's really where we're going to be losing our overall yield potential. And so I would really recommend planting in April or early May to maximize light interception and the ability of that plant to stay in R2 and produce more flowers and nodes. Now, I mentioned maturity group earlier and also relative maturity for corn. Is that a strong indicator of a response to management? So I'm gonna show you some averages over the last 3 years of research. So this is a meta-analysis. So what you're looking at is 6 locations, and each bar there, each line, has 26 varieties within it. So on the left, that means that an increase in maturity group decreases your response to management. On the right, it means an increase in maturity group increases your response to management. That's the difference, left to right. And when we look at the overall estimate down there at the bottom, what it tells us is that for every 1 maturity group increase in soybeans, we improve our response to management by 1.87 bushels. So it's not that maturity group is higher yielding than lower maturity groups. It's that you can manage higher maturity group beans more effectively for higher yields. So that's what we've seen, is that 1.87 bushel improved response management. Now, what kind of managements do we like to do? Well, in the crop physiology lab, I talked to you about 20-inch rows a few minutes ago. I'm going to talk to you about 20-inch rows now. And this is because for soybeans, they are light harvesters. They capture light, and using narrow row spacing, whether that's 15s, 20s, 10s, drilled beans, we get better light interception and reduced weed pressure when we're narrowing that row spacing early. But what does this actually translate to into yield, right? Everything comes back to yield. So for the last 7 years, we've seen that 20-inch rows have had a 5 bushel yield advantage over 30s. Just 20s and 30s, all things held equal, that's our yield advantage because, again, we're capturing more sunlight. But I talked about the response to management. So what happens to management as we put beans in narrow rows? So right here, this is 2021, our standard 30-inch row system. Those were our yields. Really good yields, especially Champagne, 89 bushels, that's great. What happens when we went to narrow rows? We actually didn't see that narrow rows were the driving factor to give us higher yields. And so we thought, okay, what's going on here? Then we wanted to look at how management factors in a narrow row system can improve yield over standard. And the average response, again, this is in one of those 26 variety trials, the average response is positive, but not dramatic. If you look at 1, 0, 4 bushels, that wouldn't really say, man, management is really good in a 20-inch row system. But what I want to show you next is these are our maximum responses to management. So when you look at, we're using varieties that range from 2.8 to 4.4. So when you average all that out, you lose the power of these 20-inch rows to maximize your response to management. And we've seen 16, 18, 21 bushel yield advantages to intensive management. And we see twice as many 90, 95 bushel averages in a 20-inch row system compared to standard. So you're improving your chances of getting to that 100, 115 bushel yield threshold. So narrow row spacing for us is the key to managing our beans for high yield. If you're trying to achieve higher yields, you want to be going into a narrow row system to capture sunlight better. Now I want to dive into this question briefly to kind of end our time. Does foliar protection enhance the yield response of soybeans to nitrogen fertilizer? On average, foliar protection has increased yield for us in the crop physiology lab, and I'll show you that here in a minute. But how does foliar protection interact with added fertilizer applications? So to test this out, we have a no nitrogen control, and then all of the following applications are made at 75 pounds of nitrogen per acre. We have 2 applications at pre-plant. One would be broadcast or a 2x2 band. Then we also have 2 applications at the R3 side dress timing, mid-row band or a wide drop. And then we compare these in-season management applications to fertigation. So fertigating nitrogen spoon-fed during the reproductive growth stages. So how does nitrogen impact soybean yield? And we compare all of these treatments across 2 varieties with and without foliar protection and 3 irrigation methods. There's a lot going on here behind the scenes, but I'm going to focus in on nitrogen and foliar protection. So this is what we think of when we say a pre-plant broadcast application, right? It's your early season weed and feeds putting out some 28 or 32 pre-plant. Now in the crop physiology lab, we don't have maybe as smooth of a ride, we don't have air conditioning. but we can still get a good application with our Preplant Broadcast sprays. Now, when we're doing our 2x2, again, we use that liquid toolbar that I showed you at the beginning to put that nitrogen 2 inches away and 2 inches below the seed. That's what we're shooting for. This is like a planter-applied nitrogen setting. So what impact does pre-plant nitrogen have on early season growth? So hopefully you can see from this picture that on the left we have our unfertilized control, on the right we have our 2x2 band. Man, those beans look good, they're green, they're larger. That's great. Now, I like showing pictures, but I want to back this up with data. Pictures and data go well together, I think. So in 2020, we did a canopy evaluation at the V6 growth stage to compare what happened. Well, we saw in our no nitrogen compared to both of our pre-plant applications, we had greener beans through NDVI, and we had a bigger canopy coverage at that V6 growth stage. So again, we talk about sunlight interception. We were able to capture more sunlight with these pre-plant applications. We did the same thing in 2021, and we didn't do NDVI this year, but we did do canopy coverage, and they were bigger. Now, if you're looking at that, you might think, oh, that's only a 2 or 3% increase in your canopy coverage. Is this really a 2-year trend in pre-plant nitrogen improving our soybean growth? Well, sometimes the data and the way we capture data doesn't accurately reflect what's going on in the field. So that's why I want to jump back to pictures. On the left there, we have our 2x2 band, and on the right, we have our unfertilized control. We were seeing this greener plants, bigger plants, healthier soybeans with these pre-plant nitrogen applications. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, doesn't adding nitrogen decrease your early season nodulation? That's always the concern when we're putting nitrogen on beans. Is that we're going to hurt their nodules? Well, to answer that question, we went out and dug up some more soybean plants, and we evaluated them for nodules. So we're counting the nodules on every root to understand how nodulation might be affected by these nitrogen treatments. And that's what our no nitrogen control looked like on the left. That's a good, healthy soybean root with lots of nodules. Now, briefly, I want to tell you a story about the first time I went into this trial and dug up a soybean plant. So I went out with my shovel, found the plot I was supposed to go to, stuck my shovel in the ground, pulled the soybean plant out, and it looked like that. And I was nervous. I'd never seen a soybean plant without nodules before. And I was furiously digging in the field trying to find a soybean plant that had nodules on it. Turns out that was our 2x2 banded treatment. We had no nodules where our nitrogen had been put close to the plant. Interestingly enough, our broadcast applications looked great. They didn't have that reduction in nodules. They were really, really healthy. So for the last 2 years, we've done these nodule ratings. I was telling you we were counting all of the nodules. And what we saw is that when we put that nitrogen close to the soybean plant in 2x2 band, we decreased nodulation. But in the broadcast application on the soil surface, we didn't impact nodulation at all in 2020 or in 2021. So our takeaways here are, number one, pre-plant nitrogen does increase early season growth, but that banded application decreases nodulation. So what happens when we take that out to yield at the end of the growing season? Well, first we have to do our side dress, right? Everybody knows the side dress application is really, really important. It's a great time to go in and add some additional nitrogen or fertility or whatever to provide that nutrition to the crop. Now, if you're paying attention, you look on there and go, Stephen, that's corn, that's not beans. We're talking about beans. Are you sure you know what you're talking about? Well, I actually scoured the internet trying to find a picture of someone with a Hagie or a commercial applicator wide dropping beans. I could not find it. I think everyone's a little bit afraid or ashamed to actually say that they're going to be wide dropping their beans. So for the first time ever, I want to show you that's what it looks like to wide drop soybeans. It can be done. And here we're using our liquid toolbar to not only put our nitrogen on in a wide drop, but we also can compare that to that mid-row coulter, right? The effective placement, whether we're putting it beside the plant or in the middle of the row. So what happened to yield? So this is 2020, our grain yield, and our response to all of these nitrogen treatments. And there's 3 things that stand out on the slide to me. Number one, it's our broadcast pre-plant, our mid-row band side dress, and our fertigation treatments all increased yield. Those were improved responses compared to those other nitrogen applications. But what makes those special is that either they're high concentrations of nitrogen away from the root zone, broadcast pre-plant and our mid-row band side dress, or with our fertigation application, we're putting small concentrations of nitrogen directly in the root zone where the crop needs it. So it's this safety effect that really, really matters. Whenever we did our 2x2 band or our wide drop, we didn't have an effect on soybean yield. What happened in 2021? Well, there's a dramatic difference in yield potential. 2021 was a great year for growing soybeans, but there was no, this trend didn't carry over year to year for nitrogen applications. So what's going on here? Well, this means for me that we have to take a deeper dive into the interaction of foliar protection and nitrogen to impact yield. So we did that. We put our foliar protection on, at the R3 growth stage. And over the last 2 years, we've seen a 3 bushel yield response to foliar protection in Champagne. And that's fungicide and insecticide at the R3 growth stage, which is really great. But what is the interaction between these two treatments? So this is the same yield slide that I just showed you, but it's nitrogen applications without foliar protection. And there is no difference in any of these yields whatsoever. There's a slight increase with fertigation, but these are not increased yields. But when we look at foliar protection, the addition of that, I think this trend becomes even clearer. When we look at our no nitrogen, our 2x2 band, and our Y drop, those are the unsafe nitrogen applications I talked about. The yield increase here is just the response to foliar protection. But when we put our nitrogen on safely, using broadcast preplant or mid-row band side dress, or especially fertigation, we are having a synergistic interaction between our nitrogen and our foliar protection to maximize soybean yield. So this slide I'm showing you is that all those pluses and minuses in 2020 and 2021. And again, there's 2 things that really stand out. And that's our broadcast preplant application gave us really good responses to nitrogen with foliar protection, but fertigation was the best. But early season, right, if we don't have a fertigation system, broadcast was the best. But that's for nitrogen. What happens if we put sulfur out on our soybeans early season? Is the same thing happening here? So I want to take a short detour to talk about sulfur for a second and talk about sulfur rates and timings. So we have pre-plant or R3 applications of sulfur at 15 or 30 pounds to the acre. And what we've seen is that these pre-plant applications of sulfur are increasing our yield. R3 applications aren't. And 15 pounds of sulfur is really the optimal rate that we've seen over the last several years to increase yield. And this matches up nicely with what I was just talking about nitrogen, because it's a high concentration of nitrogen and sulfur away from the root zone in a broadcast application, right? We're not doing a 2x2 band or anything like that. And that's what's giving us these yield increases. So nitrogen and sulfur are acting the same, whereas our pre-plant broadcast applications are the best. But what about fertigation? I want to talk about fertigation because those were our best treatments in both years. Fertigation was the best. So they had our highest yield, but they did that through reduced pot abortion. By providing that nitrogen throughout the reproductive growth stages, we were able to decrease pot abortion and increase seed number. And also we improved seed protein. So in soybeans, yield and protein are inversely related. You increase yield, you decrease protein. But what we've seen with the fertigation system is we've increased yield by 7 bushels, and we've increased seed protein. So there's an opportunity here to use a fertigation system to not only grow higher yielding beans, but also higher quality beans. So in summary, foliar protection comes first. If you're going to be adding fertility to your soybeans, foliar protection comes first. Number 2, fertigation is better than pre-plant applications, and pre-plant is better than side dress. So if you have a fertigation system, there's a lot of opportunities and potential for increasing yield. But if you don't, pre-plant applications have been more effective for us than side dress. And finally, nitrogen or sulfur applications have to have a minimal impact on nodulation. That's really key, is when we're managing soybeans, we have to make sure we're not decreasing nodulation. So how do we achieve 100 bushel beans? What does this all come back to? Well, we need to plant full maturity beans in narrow rows, which would be either in April or early May, right? Early planted beans, and use foliar protection to enhance additional fertility. This is a systems approach that brings everything together to give us the best opportunity to increase yield. So with that, I just wanted to say thank you from the Crop Physiology Lab team. We have a lot more research and a lot more things that we could talk about. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to reach out. I always want to thank our financial supporters, including NetFM, especially for the fertigation system that we have. I want to thank our collaborators that we've worked with over the last several years, and especially thanks to NetFM and NutraDrip irrigation systems bringing me out here today. So with that, does anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, so Steve, can you speak to 15, I know you talked about 20 inch. Can you speak to 15 inch, can you speak to 15 inch versus 20 inch?
Yeah, so the question was, what's the difference between 15s or 20-inch row spacing when we're talking about soybean production? We haven't done any testing in 15s just from our equipment limitations, but I think that the responses and the benefits of having that narrow row system will be the same in a 20-inch system compared to a 15. You're still capturing sunlight, you're still maximizing that sunlight interception. So I think your response to management especially would be very consistent, whether that's in 15s or 20s. Yes, sir.
In your fertigation trial, how many applications did you do and at what stages?
The soybean one?
Yeah.
So the question was, what applications were we making of nitrogen on soybeans and at what growth stages? So we took that 75 pounds of nitrogen and split it into 12.5 pounds of nitrogen every growth stage from R1 to R5.5. So 12.5 pounds at R1, R2, R3, R4, R5, and R5.5. That's how we applied our nitrogen to soybeans. Yes, sir.
So on the fertigation, how long does it take a soybean planted 15 inches away from the drip tape to get its roots into the fertigation zone? How much water does it take, or how long does it take
to the soybean roots to get down there?
Soybean to actually get over there. When you have a little plants coming up, it's the roots. I'm just curious.
Yeah, so the question was, in a 15-inch system where you're splitting the drip tape, how fast or how quickly can your soybean roots actually access that, that irrigation water? I don't know the speed, the rate of root growth, but we have seen that soybean roots grow down to about 24 inches in depth. So we would expect probably by R1 that they would have roots down to that depth, which is why we always initiate our fertigation applications, in those reproductive growth stages. Shoot, this year in 2021, we had 7 trifoliate beans that were at R1 because they had flowers on them. So those beans are going to continue to grow and continue to grow. So for us, we've seen the most benefit to fertigation during the reproductive growth stages. And I think when you get to that growth stage, the beans will have access to the added water and nutrition that's coming from the dripper tape.
So the fertigation system is not going to, when we talk about that little seed coming out, all
right.
That fertility still has to be applied some other way for the first through R1.
Yes, and that's why we really like pairing the pre-plant applications with fertigation. But you got to make sure it's safe for the soybeans. But you get these bigger plants, you can better capture sunlight, you have better improved photosynthesis, and that gets you off to a really good start, which then you can kind of hand the baton to the fertigation system and let you manage nitrogen during reproduction with that system. So correct.
So how did you apply the nitrogen then to R1?
So we would do that.
You broadcasted that 75,000, and you switched over to the...
Yes. Yep.
So for clarification, on the fertigation trial you showed, did you broadcast nitrogen before the fertigation was kicked on?
So no, so that fertigation treatment was only fertigation, only nitrogen applied during reproduction. There's data that I didn't show where we did do broadcast applications paired with fertigation, and we saw increasing yields, but it wasn't economical, which is why I didn't highlight that specifically. But we have done that where you pair pre-plant applications with fertigation, and we get higher yields, but it's not necessarily a synergistic increase.
So my last question is that
Was all of that, all the data you showed us today, was that all a positive ROI?
All of the data I showed was probably not a positive ROI, especially when we're pairing like all these banded fertilizer applications with foliar protection. Not everything's ROI, because our focus is the physiological potential of what we're trying to do. However, I do know specifically that last nitrogen study that I was discussing, before the price of nitrogen went through the roof, the cutoff on yield on bushels to pay was 2 bushels. Soybean prices are higher now, so is fertilizer prices. So I do know that there's an opportunity to increase your ROI with pre-plant nitrogen applications on soybeans. I do think there's potential there. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
When you harvest that, what's your moisture of your beans? Especially on the, see what we have trouble with, the longer season you go, the plants are so green, you can't get them through the combine, and the damn beans are 9% when you finally get to them.
So the question was, what's the harvesting like where moisture stems when you're putting fertigation and foliar protection applications on your beans? We actually did experience that this year. I mentioned in the nitrogen study we had two different varieties. One was a 3.6, one was a 3.9. The 3.9 stayed green forever. With foliar protection, it was wet, it was hard to cut, and it also did have some lodging or some effects of those bigger plants falling over. But I was encouraged by the fact that the 3.6, which yielded exactly the same as the 3.9 when we averaged everything together, that one actually didn't have any of those lodging problems or dry down issues. So I think, especially if you're trying to manage early planted beans with nitrogen, I would focus on picking the right variety to go with those management practices, because otherwise you will get into situations with longer and longer maturity beans with foliar protection and nitrogen. They're going to stay green forever. So pairing that together, I think, is a good way to combine managements to get the best response and outcome for you. Yes, sir.
On your pre-plant nitrogen, what's the science behind the rate that you use of 75 pounds?
Yeah. So we chose 75 pounds of nitrogen based on a calculation for the amount of nitrogen that would be mineralized by the soil. So I would say 75 pounds is higher than pretty much all the literature would suggest. 35 to 40 pounds of nitrogen is more what we would recommend if we're trying to make the best application on beans. We were actually also trying to look at how can we reduce nodulation with nitrogen? What is the impact of that placement? So if I was going to make a recommendation, I wouldn't say that 75 pounds is what everyone should be doing. More like 35 to 40 pounds of nitrogen is a good way to apply nitrogen at a consistent rate to get these yield increases. We've done some work with John Deere at the Crop Physiology Lab, and they've also done 2x2 where they're putting on 30 pounds of nitrogen in a 2x2, and they don't have nodulation decreases, and they're getting similar yield advantages. So that's why I think there's a lot of opportunity to apply lower rates of nitrogen to beans, even in a 2x2 banded application. Yes, sir.
Responses to phosphorus and potash.
So the question is responses to phosphorus and potash on beans. So in the last 2 years, we actually have not seen dramatic responses to phosphorus or potassium on soybeans in some of the research that we've been doing. I think a lot of that is our organic matter. We have high amounts of mineralization, high amounts of available P and K, and so we haven't seen a response in, say, Champaign or Northern Illinois where we get more and more organic matter. But when we have gone on the lighter soil, say 1.7% organic matter in Southern Illinois, that's when we see our best responses to potassium and phosphorus is in lighter soil. So it's been inconsistent for us, but I think your best chance to get those yield responses of 3 to 5 bushels is what we've seen is in lighter soils.
So do you see a response where the fertilizer phosphorus potash put on corn year before compared to beans on beans? So it's the second year, you see the response on the beans?
So that's a great question. The question is, what about if you fertilize your corn in this year, what happens to the beans the next year from that old fertility, right? What's the beans response there? We've actually done a very little bit of this research looking at old fertility, second year fertility on beans, and it does seem that they like old fertility. For us, there wasn't I think it was 2 to 3 bushel difference with that second year application compared to no fertilizer. So it's small, it's not extremely dramatic, but we have seen it consistently that soybeans do like fertilizer from the past year or even fertilizer from a fall application compared to a spring. We've seen better responses to phosphorus, especially from a fall application of fertilizer compared to the spring. Any other questions?
Yeah, so Stephen, on that, on the sulfur application,
Yeah.
at what stage of growth did you see that maximized as far as ROI?
So your question is which growth stage of application would be best for a sulfur application? So all of our best of potassium.
Yes.
All of the applications that we make for potassium are pre-plant applications. We haven't done much research with in-season potassium management.
One question from online, back on the corn and
Yeah.
the root development, what impact does management have on root development? Is it all hybrid related, or how much does management play into that?
So that's a really good question. How does management impact root development? So we've seen with banded fertilizer compared to broadcast, for instance, we get a little bit of a larger root with banding we get a smaller root with banding compared to broadcast, because we're putting all that fertilizer in one spot, and the corn roots will proliferate to a banded system. Whereas with broadcast, we have gotten a larger root system because it has to explore and mine for more of that soil fertility. So there are some management interactions. Mainly the research that we've done has been row spacing, like I showed, but we haven't really looked at irrigation or fertigation, or a lot of differences with fertilizer placement on root size. Dr. Bilo always says that you pay for roots in yield. So when we talk about smaller root systems, we want to have as small of a root system as possible to maximize our yield, because the bigger your root system gets, that's more energy the plant has to send below ground when we want it to be sending energy into the ear. So that's why, especially with like a fertigation system in Subdrip, you can manage a smaller root size more effectively by providing its water exactly where it needs it. And that's what we think one of the advantages of using SDI is we can get away with a smaller root system and still be able to provide nutrition and water to that crop all the time. Any other questions? I have no idea where we're at on time, so I apologize if I've gone long.
So is this all thrown out less than 1% organic matter?
So the question was, is all of this not applicable at 1% organic matter?
That's applicable, but the results are all different on this month.
So the results are some of the smaller, more minute things may differ. However, like the hybrid responses, the management yield potential I showed for corn, we see it even more important on low fertility soils to have narrow rows with improved fertilizer placement in those lower yielding environments, especially when it comes to banding nitrogen. We've seen the advantages of banding and side dress applications are maximized in 1.7% organic matter compared to 4.8 up in northern Illinois. So a lot of this stuff I think is even more important when you get into tougher ground, because we have to manage for more success. Yes, sir.
Any differences in planting population on beans versus intensive or regular management?
So the question is, what's the difference in planting population, or the optimal planting population by management, intensive versus standard planting day, that kind of stuff. And we haven't done a lot of research on planting populations because of our limitations as a lab. However, the earlier you plant, there's concerns about stand, but I do think there's opportunities to maximize a lower planting population of soybeans using an intensive system, because you're letting each plant have better access to that nutrition. And like I showed with the tough early season conditions, soybeans really do adapt to the fertilizer and the fertility environment around them. So I don't think that you need to be pushing 100, 160 or even more beans to get maximum yield. You can do that at lower planting populations. Any other questions? All right.
Okay, let's give Stephen
All right.
a hand.
Thank you guys very much.